Okay, so we'll start off from where we left, which is soft copy 114, physical book, page number 111, the last paragraph. In the process of evolution, unconscious God did obtain full consciousness, not of his original infinite state, but of the gross and finite. After all, the struggle during the course of evolution, which achieved full consciousness for God, no doubt, at what price was it gained? The cost was the burden of legacy of impressions accumulated in the gross form, the last medium of association of the evolving consciousness of God, through which full consciousness was completely evolved in the instant that God identified himself with the human form. Therefore, God in the man state is still unaware of his original state despite having gained full consciousness. This unawareness is due to the unwanted, though necessary, burden of gross impressions still clinging to the full consciousness gained. The process through which God in the man state struggles to unburden these finite impressions in one which takes place through opposite impressions, and this is called the process of reincarnation. So there is a reference to 19. We'll go there. Yeah, Sunil?
Namita is not able to get in. Same problem. Somebody should let you in soon.
Oh, yeah. I think some days that happens and some days it doesn't.
But,
So they're using artificial intelligence, I guess. Sorry, Namita. Are you on now?
Yes, you can get it now.
So anyway, I wanted to read that paragraph again.
Sure.
Everybody can go to where, Baba? Everybody can go back to mute. I have one doubt here. I'll read the paragraph again. The fact that was made out in the earlier paragraphs was awareness is full when he comes to the human conscious. I mean, the consciousness and awareness is full when the human state is reached. But here, awareness is absent, is what he said. Full awareness is not gained. So I'm going to read this paragraph again. In the process of evolution, unconscious God did obtain full consciousness, not of his original infinite state, but of the gross and finite. After all, the struggle during the course of evolution, which achieved full consciousness for God, no doubt, at what price was it gained? The cost was the burden of the legacy of impressions accumulated in the gross form, which is the last medium of association of evolving consciousness of God, through which full consciousness was completely evolved in the instant that God identified himself with the human form. Therefore, God in the man state is still unaware of his original state despite having gained full consciousness. This unawareness is due to the unwanted, though necessary, burden of the gross impression still clinging to the full consciousness gained. So there is an element of unawareness which is due to the unwanted, though necessary, burden of the gross impression still clinging to the full consciousness gained. The process through which God in the man state struggles to unburden these finite impressions is one which takes place through opposite impressions and is called the process of reincarnation. And now we'll go to reincarnation in the other book. So, can someone help me with the numbers? It's 19. Yeah, so it's much down.
$238.
Okay, thank you. 5. So it's funny what happened last evening. So I was completely normal. My last call finished at around 2:30, and at 2:20 I opened a window, okay, and closed it in 10 minutes. But because of the rain that we've had, I think some bug or something, and I was completely gone. I was hardly able to speak. Okay, so 19. This is where we are. Real birth and real death. So he had referred to it as reincarnation, and the reference is 19. Real birth and real death. There's one real birth and one real death. We were talking about that in our discussion last before the end of the call. Kama was summarizing. You are born once and you really die only once. What is the real birth? It is the birth of a drop in the ocean of reality. What is meant by the birth of a drop in the ocean of reality? It is the advent of individuality, born of indivisibility through a glimmer of the first, most finite consciousness, which transfixed cognizance of limitation into the unlimited. What is meant by the real death? It is consciousness getting free from all limitations. Freedom from all limitations is real death. It is really the death of all limitations. It is liberation. In between the real birth and real death, there is no such reality as the so-called births and deaths. What really happens in the intermediate stage, known as births and deaths, is that the limitations of consciousness gradually wear off until the consciousness is free from all limitations. Ultimately, consciousness, totally free from all limitations, experiences the unlimited reality eternally. Real dying is equal to real living. Therefore, I stress, die for God, and you will live as God. You are first a child, then you grow old and drop the body, but you never die and never were born. In the East, Vedantists believe in reincarnation and in a number of births and deaths until one attains godhood. The Muslims believe in one birth only and one death only. The Christians and the Zoroastrians hold the same belief. All are right. But Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Zoroaster all meant what I mean by real birth and real death. I say you are born once and die once. The so-called births and deaths are only sleeps and wakings. The difference between sleep and death is that after you sleep, you awake and find yourself in the same body. But after death, you awake in a different body. You never die. Only the blessed ones die and become one with God. That we can go back to the main book. Any reactions before we continue? Okay, I take that as no. In trying the third, I'm going to the third paragraph in on page 112. In trying to unburden consciousness from the finite impressions, the gross consciousness of God necessarily has to experience these impressions and then exhaust them by innumerable opposite experiences through a series of reincarnations. Experiences, opposite by nature, are absolutely essential to exhaust the impressions because opposite experiences alone can shake up the roots of thickly set or firmly established varied impressions. In the process of reincarnation, the fully gross conscious God in man, fortified with fully developed subtle and mental bodies, which are consistently, though unconsciously used, must necessarily experience a series of unending chains of varied and innumerable experiences, opposite by nature, in order that the impressions of opposites might be exhausted. These impressions are constantly being imprinted upon or picked up by the mental body or by the mind of man and are retained or released by the subconscious in man. When these impressions are released through the subconsciousness and full consciousness of God in man, as man, he has varied experiences according to the variety and intensity of the impressions released. Whereas the subtle body of man, which is the seat of energy, energizes these impressions to activate man into committing actions in his everyday life of either the dream or awake state, as the case may be. These actions are also opposite in nature to the varied, related, opposite impressions. Thus, in the man state on the gross plane, although energy and mind are fully developed and are continually and consistently used, yet they are employed indirectly and unconsciously. When on the planes of energy, that is on the subtle planes, this energy is divinely and consciously made use of, but on the subtle planes, the mind is made use of indirectly and unconsciously. On the mental planes, when this mind is made use of divinely and consciously, energy is only made use of indirectly and unconsciously. He's making a reference to the unconscious use of the mind. See also, Meher Baba, Control of Mind over Energy and Matter, Life at its Best, edited by I.V. Deuce, San Francisco, 1957. Okay. It necessarily follows that while this gross conscious God in the man state experiences the opposites in the gross world, he reincarnates a number of times, sometimes as a male, sometimes as a female, in the varied castes, creeds, nationalities, and colors, and in varied different places and continents, always reviewing opposite impressions and exhausting them by experiences of opposites. It is always through these diverse oppositional impressions and their respective opposed experiences that gross conscious God in the man state on earth can possibly one day, after millions of rebirths, thin out the thick-set impressions. It is the process of this cycle of so-called deaths and births of human forms that ultimately urges the consciousness of the gross conscious God in the man state to involve. This process of involution of consciousness gradually takes shape when the gross impressions gradually grow fainter and scarcer. Involution of the consciousness of God in the man state is only possible when the opposite impressions, after a very, very long process, gradually thin out through the process of unfailing reincarnations, which leads to the limit of gross impressions. When the limit of gross impressions is reached, then the stage is attained where gross conscious God in the man state gradually becomes disassociated from the gross world as the involution of the consciousness begins to enfold the consciousness. Simultaneously, with the beginning of the involution of consciousness, God in the man state gradually disassociates from experiencing the impressions of the opposites of the gross world. It was seen that God attained full consciousness through the process of evolution and consciousness, but the full consciousness gained was a consciousness that was impressioned. In order to wipe the impressions off of the full consciousness gained, the process of reincarnation and the process of involution of consciousness must be followed through. The process of the evolution of consciousness of God was compared to the gradual opening of the eyes of man. When man opened his eyes completely, it was compared with the end of the evolution of consciousness because God then had gained full consciousness. The process of the reincarnation of God in the man state may be compared with the man completely awake with full consciousness and with eyes wide open, gaining diverse experiences opposite to the impressions he gathered during the years of his life and which he now actively experiences during the course of his days, forgetting his own self amid the execution of his multifarious activities. Now, the urge for the involution of the consciousness of God in the man state may be compared with a man who, having been engrossed in his activities of the day, at last finds time, when the day's work is practically over, to pay attention to his own self rather than to his activities. Thus urged, man's attention shifts automatically from external activities towards paying proper attention to his own self. Just as full consciousness was evolved in 7 different stages, so too evolved full consciousness is completely involved through the process of involution in 7 different stages. These 7 stages of involution of consciousness are named the 7 planes of consciousness. The 7th plane is the 7th and last stage in the process of involution of consciousness, where consciousness is completely involved and God consciously realizes his eternal, infinite existence. That is, God, who was originally unconscious, now becomes oblivious of oblivion itself. The 7 stages of gradual involution of the consciousness of God in the man state may be compared with the wide open eyes of a man, at first gazing ahead of him and away from him. Then, in an attempt to behold his own self, he lowers his eyes gradually, shifting them in 7 stages until eventually his range of vision includes his own self. Though through unfailing numerous reincarnations, wherein a limit to gross experiences is reached, and when the gross impressions become faint and almost defunct, the gross consciousness of gross conscious God in the man state gradually begins to involve, and God in the state of man is initiated into the process of involution of consciousness. At this stage, the involving gross consciousness experiences partially the first stage or the plane of the subtle world through the medium of the already fully developed subtle body of God in the man state. This is the initial stage before the first plane, where the involved gross consciousness of gross conscious God in the man state obtains the first glimpses of the first plane of the subtle world and experiences their impressions partially through the gross body and partially through the subtle body. Here, both the gross and the subtle senses are simultaneously used. So we'll spend some time to familiarize ourselves with the diagram and then come back here. Obviously, one of the members of the class is ahead of us, so she's already drawn this, I think, right, Navita? You've already done the chart 4, correct? You explained this to us. So you're ahead.
I have to explain.
No. I think you did this. Yeah. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
That's what I was
I'm the best pupil in this class.
Exactly. So that always class has somebody who's ahead, right? So even before the teacher gets
Yes.
there, you're finished. So you're that in our group. So good. So on the left is the evolution of consciousness through the gross forms. Consciousness completes no higher forms. The last form is the man form. So stones and metals, vegetation, worms, fishes, birds, animals, and man. Now again, this is the visually, though it's the ascent, it's shown as a descent, and it's an evolution of consciousness. and the involution of consciousness is the ascent, which is coming from the first plane through the sixth plane and the seventh plane finally. So the Jeev Atma is fully conscious here. In what is this? Why is it called the seventh stage? First stage. Oh, okay. First stage, second, third, fourth,
Stone,
fifth,
metal,
seventh.
vegetable,
Okay. Yeah. Got it. So the 7 stages of evolution of consciousness, the 7 stages of opening of the eyes that we read earlier, and I believe maybe we are going to read the 7 stages of involving the self to look inward, which the Jivatma. I mean, that's the parallel we will see in the man's waking state. So from the Jivatma, you go up to the seventh plane. Seventh plane is merged in Paramatma, Shiv Atma, fully conscious and matured. Just as the fully evolved consciousness of man in the seventh stage considers the stone consciousness as the most crude, so also the fully involved consciousness of the man God in the seventh plane considers the consciousness of human beings as the most immature consciousness. Such is the vast difference in the factor of consciousness. With that, I'll go and continue.
uh, uh, uh,
Sure.
in the diagram, you can
Sure.
also appreciate that there are two lines, one red and black. The red represents the development of consciousness. The black is the impressions.
Oh,
And we
yeah.
lose the impressions, and then the consciousness gradually goes ahead.
Perfect. Super.
Uh,
So impressions are carried right through the evolution and become fainter in the upward
Man
journey.
stage, where through reincarnations we gradually lose them by experiencing the opposites.
Opposites.
So I am unable to understand this experiencing the opposites. If anyone can put some light on that.
So this is what we discussed almost like a week back, and I was also struggling with that. So the only thing I found was that little reference with the video that I sent out, but I believe it's just a conscious choice of the Jivatma to experience all aspects that are available through the field of impressions. So if I am born in the white race as a Caucasian rich man, I want to now experience the opposite of that. I want to be on the other side of the racial spectrum. So I might be born as a black man, poor, or struggling, and so on. If there is a healthy aspect in one incarnation, I'd like to experience the unhealthy. But I know the struggle for us to understand, for me, and I'm sure probably you're thinking the same way, is those opposites are not according to the law of karma as we know it, because in the law of karma, we tend to believe that if you do something, you beget the opposite of that. But that's not the opposite that I'm understanding in this. It is the opposites that are in nature. So I might be using one birth to experience all the things that are so called morally good, but I also need another birth to experience all the morally bad things, because that's the opposites that are inherent in nature. This is my understanding. I may be wrong, so I open it up.
That is okay. Experiencing the opposites in your exposition now, but what is that which makes us learn something and then discard something? So, what is the portion of us which is making that decision? Is it will?
Actually, I can say that there is a point. Says, for example, we have never smoked a cigarette. Okay, let's look at addictions as an example. Whether it's drinking booze or smoking a cigarette, it happens for the first time. Okay, so there are two choices. you want to experience smoking and then you give it up. But what happens is there is a tendency that you can keep smoking and then get addicted to it. First of all, there was no addiction, right? So what happens is, to answer your question, how to neutralize it, as you go through that, you suddenly realize smoking is bad for health. Now one has to put that effort to stop smoking. You know, that is the kind of opposite impression you're doing, the opposite experience. So this is just an example, and in the 84 lakh lives that Baba talks about, you know, we have to, as Karthik said, that you have to experience all the different aspects of nature, both the pluses and minuses. Then you exhaust your impressions. The question is like, when do you stop doing that act? I think that was your question, I believe, right?
How do we get out of this? Because just experiencing, I feel, doesn't make any difference. You go
Uh,
through whatever is you are destined to. But are you
okay.
learning a lesson here, or say subverting or coming out of this?
Yes, you are learning a lesson, because what I have noticed is, unless people go through suffering in their life, then only people start asking the fundamental questions of life. For example, Baba said that the tendency of human beings is to make those things important that are not important, and things that are important, we make it unimportant. Say, for example, the only goal of a human being is to answer this question, who am I? Because that is the original whim.
Yes.
And the who am I question is also answered, that we are all walking Buddhas, but we are in the process. And we are in the process because we have gained sanskaras through evolution. Okay. Now, the second part of the question is, when do we discriminate? So, this is where the Vivek and Vairagya comes, detachment and discrimination. So, detachment and discrimination comes. There is a chapter in Discourses which is
Ah,
beautifully said on three kinds of Vairagya.
okay.
Suppose you go to that Shamshan Bhumi Vairagya, Tivra Vairagya, and Purna Vairagya. So,
Hmm.
for example, when you go to a friend's funeral, immediately you realize that, man, life is very limited. I have to start looking at the real things of life. But as soon as you get into your car, you are back to your old ways.
Yeah.
That is called Shamshan Bhumi Vairagya, cremation ground detachment. Then the second one is Tivra Vairagya, which is intense dispassion. Say, when you lose a beloved, or you have a big crash in your business, or something drastic happens. So for 4 or 5 years, you are completely into, like, I have to become, something different. This is
Yes.
all my. But then after 5 years, the sanskaras again take over and you go back to your old life. So that is also the. So Baba says, like, Purna Vairagya, when you have complete understanding of suffering, the cause of suffering, then you start going into this involution process.
Yeah.
So this is what I have understood.
Yes, that is what is that portion of the human makeup which does this, and how do we train that to do this effectively?
Again, awareness, it's right knowledge and right action. You know,
Okay.
so right knowledge would be self knowledge, like by reading God Speaks. We realize that this whole thing is like a divine dream, of God. So you want to focus on your realized self, the self awareness, self actualization, self realization, all those things. So
Okay.
when does that happen is up to each one of us. When I
Yes,
think, according to me, when you go through deep suffering, then a shift happens.
Mhm. Okay.
Does it
That
answer
answers
your
the.
question, or are you looking for the semantic construct within what we have understood? So in that, I think it's Jivatma, right? The Jivatma is going through that process, and that is making that is experiencing those different stages of Vairagya, right?
Huh. So, as through what we have read through till now,
Mm-hmm.
it is a gradual progress of what is happening.
Yes.
So it is a flow of what is happening, and then now we are coming into the involution process. So how do we hasten this involution process, or how do we effectively do this so that we will go through these planes faster, or maybe achieve the goal earlier, or realization can come up in this life itself? So for that, what is that we have to do?
Okay.
That
I
is the
can
big.
uh,
Ah.
I can quote another aspect of
Namita
discourses.
also was talking of this about a week back. I want to get realized in this life itself.
Long answer. Right, Kama? I don't know. I'm guessing
Well,
it's a long answer.
no, it's actually, if you read the chapter on love in discourses, there is a part where Baba talks about, the kind of love we have for Baba. We all call ourselves Baba lovers.
Ah,
Technically, we are not pure Baba lovers because Baba
yes,
said that pure love is the gift of the perfect master, unless what we call as the seven deadly sins. Here, Baba gives only five: infatuation, lust, greed, anger, jealousy have to be eliminated. Okay? Unless these five things are dissolved, and this is all part of the ego. Okay,
mm,
according to my understand, the way I define ego is all the English alphabets: anger, aversion, backbiting, craving, duality, uh, you know, uh, so expectations, fear, greed, hatred, jealousy. It's open the dictionary.
ah,
Just like in dictionary, we have synonyms and antonyms. I think that kind of answers the opposite of experiences. Okay,
mm,
synonyms and antonyms. So Baba said that unless these five aspects, or what we call seven deadly sins, are eliminated, which is part of the ego, then the gift of pure love descends into the disciple or the spiritual aspirant. And that's when you start actually going into the involution process. Involution process will not start till we lose our what we call as gross lust, subtle greed,
yeah,
and mental anger. Baba said that
okay.
we have to convert lust into love, greed into generosity, and anger into compassion and tolerance. The kama, krodha, lobha, those three
Ah,
variables, main variables. But then there are many sub variables, as you know, like I said, all the English alphabet. So ultimately,
yes.
the ego has to be slowly dissolved. You know, that's
Yes,
my understanding.
I go back to the prayers once again. So the first
Yes,
part of the prayer is to understand God. The second
correct.
part is how do we involute? How do we do that? And he clearly
Yes,
mentions what all we are supposed to do.
exactly. I think the prayer of repentance, and there is another one called How to Love God. There are 8 postulates that Baba has given.
Oh,
So
that I'm
that
not sure.
also
Okay.
is,
Uh,
yes, How to Love God also. Yes.
I think we'll put it up on the files here. Yeah.
thank you for
Oh, you're
clarifying.
welcome.
Okay. So I'll continue.
Hmm.
115 second paragraph. At this stage, the involving gross consciousness experiences partially the first stage or plane of the subtle world through the medium of the already fully developed subtle body of God in the man state. This is the initial stage before the first plane, where an involved gross consciousness of gross conscious God in the man state obtains the first glimpses of the first plane of the subtle world and experiences their impressions partially through the gross body and partially through the subtle body. Here, both the gross and subtle senses are simultaneously used. This is the stage where God in the man state stands, as it were, on the line of demarcation which delimits the gross world from the subtle world, and where the consciousness of God in the man state experiences strange things. With his gross eyes, he obtains glimpses of the subtle plane. With his gross ears, he hears celestial music of the subtle plane. With his gross nose, he enjoys subtle scents. In short, gross conscious God in the man state, partially on the first plane of the subtle world, experiences subtle impressions with the gross senses. With further involution of gross conscious God gradually experiences completely the first plane of the subtle world. Now, the gross consciousness of God in the man state is no longer gross consciousness but is subtle consciousness. Subtle conscious God in the man state gradually becomes conscious of the second plane of the subtle world as the involution progresses on to infold consciousness further and further. This subtle world is the domain of infinite energy, the infinite and unlimited power, which is an aspect of the infinite triune nature of God, when radiated from unbounded infinity into the finite worlds of illusion, is translated into the finite and manifested in the domain of the subtle world in the form of infinite energy of the subtle world. Thus, in the second plane, God in human form is subtle conscious, and therefore he is not conscious of the gross body and the mental body, the mind. But the God in human form does work through the gross body and through the mind, the mental body, not directly, but on and from the subtle plane. Therefore, if the subtle conscious God in the man state is unconscious of the gross body and of the mental body and does not experience directly the gross and mental worlds, still God in the man state does make use of the gross body, though not directly but from the subtle plane, through various aspects of the gross, and is therefore observed from all outward appearances as an ordinary gross conscious human form, which eats, drinks, sleeps, sees, feels, hears, and so forth. Similarly, God in the man state, when conscious of the second plane of the subtle world, does use his mental body, the mind, not directly, but through various aspects which give it the outward appearance of being an ordinary gross conscious human form, having thoughts, desires, and emotions. At this stage, with greater involution of consciousness, subtle conscious God in the man state on the second plane gains greater awareness of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere and is now capable of performing fixed or minor miracles of lower degree through the release of this infinite energy, and can demonstrate such powers as converting a dry tree into a green one and vice versa, stopping railway trains and motor cars, filling a dry well with water, and so forth. This subtle conscious God in the man state on the second plane experiences the subtle world with the subtle senses of his subtle body. He is now totally not conscious of the gross world, though from all outward appearances he remains and functions as an ordinary man, eating, sleeping, having feelings of pain and pleasure, and so forth. Yet, actually, his involved consciousness experiences not the gross, but the subtle sphere, and creates fresh subtle impressions through his subtle senses, which are three in number, with faculties of seeing, smelling, and hearing. Further involution of consciousness makes it possible for God in the man state to experience the third plane of the subtle world. Here, subtle consciousness gains greater awareness of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere, and God in the man state experiences greater finite power. In this stage, he is capable of performing grand miracles, such as giving sight to the blind, restoring limbs to the maimed, and sometimes even raising the dead into life. In this state, subtle conscious God in the man state is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere, just as a gross conscious human form is capable of traveling from one continent to another using the gross vehicles at his disposal. The second and third planes of the subtle world are the two major planes which are solely in the domain of the subtle world. The first plane is partially in the domain of the subtle world and partially of the gross world. Similarly, the fourth plane is partially of the subtle world and partially of the mental world. For this reason, the fourth plane is said to be the threshold of the mental world. Now, with gradual, though progressive gain in the involution of the consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state, the consciousness of God experiences the fourth plane of the subtle come mental. In the fourth plane, God, in the man state, is fully conscious of the subtle body and completely experiences the subtle sphere. And therefore, he is completely aware of the subtle nature of the subtle sphere, which is infinite energy. This is the very same infinite energy, which is the finite aspect in the nothingness of that infinite and unbounded power of God, which was latent in God's state of the everything. In the man state is fully equipped with infinite energy, and thus he is now capable of raising the dead and even creating new forms in new worlds, breathing with life. Subtle conscious God in the man state in the fourth plane is in reality infinite energy personified. This infinite energy of the fourth plane of the subtle come mental worlds is not the ordinary so-called energy of the gross world. It is that infinite energy which is called the breath of all life or prana, which can cause all things to become alive. It is this energy which, when infinite, can create living things out of dust. Although this energy be infinite, is yet by no means equivalent to the reality of that infinite power of God. This infinite power of God, when translated into illusion, becomes the finite aspect of the infinite energy of the fourth plane of the subtle come mental worlds. So he talked in the first paragraph of raising the dead. Those on the third plane of consciousness can only raise the dead of the subhuman species. So only on the fourth plane you can give the gift of life through the use of the energy. Then it's animals and so on. Subtle conscious God. Subtle conscious God and possessing the key to the store of the infinite energy of the fourth plane is now firmly established on the threshold of the mental world and is confronted by the full blast of the intense desires, emotions, and thoughts which are aspects of mind of the mental world. Though the fourth plane is the exalted stage of consciousness where God in the man state consciously experiences himself as infinite energy personified, yet it is the state of experiences of the God of the so-called darkest night. No, let me read that again. Though the fourth plane is the exalted stage of consciousness where God in the man state consciously experiences himself as infinite energy personified, yet it is the state of experiences of the so-called darkest night, because here the consciousness of God in the man state undergoes the experience of being caught, as it were, between the devil and the deep. Fired by intense desires and emotions, the overpowering incitement or temptation to wield and use the infinite energy which is at his command proves a treacherous foe at this juncture when the involution of consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state is unfailingly and rapidly progressing towards the mental sphere where it will gain mastery over all desires, emotions, and thoughts. If desires at their zenith emanated by the mental plane, confronting the consciousness of God in the man state in the fourth plane, overpower God in the man state and on the fourth plane, and if the forces generated by the infinite energy at his command are released by him, then the experience of the liberation of infinite energy at this juncture often proves fatal, especially when he grossly misuses the forces liberated by infinite energy to satisfy selfish ends indiscriminately. At this juncture, on the fourth plane, if the power of the infinite energy of the subtle world is indiscriminately liberated, the resultant effect of the complete liberation of that energy is almost unimaginable by gross consciousness. However, an idea could be gathered of that result from the fantastic experiences of the liberation of nuclear energy, which is merely one of the gross aspects of the infinite energy of the subtle world. Thus, the involved consciousness of God in the man state succumbs to the temptations of experiencing the complete liberation of infinite energy in the fourth plane of consciousness. The inevitable experience is so severe that the full consciousness gained and the subtle consciousness experienced totally disintegrate into the most finite consciousness, identifying God once again with the most finite gross form of stone. Consequently, the consciousness of stone conscious God must once again go through the whole process of the evolution of consciousness, identifying himself with gross forms until he identifies with man and again wins full consciousness. It is a fact that when consciousness is once gained, it can never.
Can I come in here?
Sure.
This going back to the stone form, this was referred to earlier itself.
Yes.
So in the evolution, there is no one-way traffic. So we can go back to any form, depending on what we do not properly realize and use up the energy for unwanted processes. That is my
Correct.
understanding.
Correct, but my understanding that application is more as an exception than as a rule, in the sense that the journey is descent and ascent in the normal progression, but he specifically makes a reference to the fourth plane misuse of powers, which result in the regression to stone gross form.
Yes,
I think this is the only instance he specifically has referred multiple times ahead as well. Right?
Technically, once you become a human being, you will never go many of those kingdoms, except in this particular fourth plane, as you said, you misuse your
powers. Yeah.
And one interesting aspect I would like to bring it here is, if you imagine this plane and all our Puranas where these say Vishwamitra and those who had a lot of powers, they created universes of their own and all that. I think this is the picture where they reach certain level and then try to use up that all that energy for unwanted process. And ultimately they don't realize God by that process.
Correct.
Yeah. Also, one thing Baba mentions is the best way to go to the seventh plane is go blindfolded. So that is why, because there are two ways of doing it. One is you can go by the book, and up till the sixth plane, you can go without the guidance of a guru. But to go from the sixth to the seventh plane, the divine theme is that you need the blessing or grace of a perfect master or avatar. So, it's so that's how the whole divine theme works,
Okay.
Perfect.
Tushar is very silent.
Yeah. Tushar?
Yeah, I think I'm not able to explain. Perhaps limitation of this virtual world. I have answered all these questions discussed in the last 2 days, but unfortunately, I'm not able to put it through well.
It is the limitations of our impressions and understanding that we are uncovering in future classes than in earlier ones.
Yeah, we'll have I think once we finish the reading, maybe we can have more sessions of just discussing.
Yes.
I find that when we are there in real, it's different. I find this problem on Facebook also, where I'm very active. A lot of people simply delete me because of my comments. They come from conscious mind. So your subconscious is very active, good or bad, whatever. Yeah, I feel I am very aware of this fact now, right now. And I don't want to put my mind, as I said yesterday also, in what Baba is telling us. Let us concentrate on Baba.
Okay. Okay.
Correct.
We'll discuss after this reading is finished. You
Sure.
keep on marking, whatever, wherever
Yes. Yes. Yes.
those paragraphs.
No, I think gradually our confidence in understanding and unfolding this is also better and better, right? So, this journey has been very, very greatly revealing to me. These classes. So,
True. If you read this 10 times, your 10th time will
reveal something else.
do good. And see, what is true for you is only true for you, not for the. We are all at different stages of evolution.
True. Okay, I continue.
Yeah.
If God in the man state in the fourth plane does not misuse the powers of infinite energy, but uses them discriminately without being overpowered by desires, then with further involution of consciousness, the subtle conscious God in the man state experiences directly the sixth plane of the mental world, skipping over the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world. But if God in the man state in the fourth plane neither uses nor abuses the power of infinite energy, then gradually, with further involution of consciousness, subtle conscious God in the man state in the fourth plane of consciousness crosses the threshold of the mental world and begins to experience the fifth plane of consciousness. The fifth and sixth planes of consciousness are fundamentally the planes of the mental sphere of the mind. He describes desires, so let's finish that and then continue. Desires must be consciously wiped out because they can create new impressions further and in turn further desires which may lead to further binding actions. Consciousness is preoccupied with such impressions and their physical expression rather than with the real self. If these impressions are wiped away consciously, the soul, Atma, will then begin to perceive the truth and will begin to emancipate itself from the tyranny of worldly desires. The individual, Jivatma, minus life of desires, becomes soul, Atma, and is always the unconscious Almighty. It is while we are living that life must be given up. To renounce worldly desires while retaining consciousness of unconsciousness is the real goal of life. It's an editorial comment. But then I'm further confused by one line here. I'll
Is
read
this,
again.
is this written by Baba or someone else?
No, this is an editorial comment. This is written by,
So
I think, Don Stevens.
we should not pay attention because I don't agree with this.
Yeah, I'm also confused by this one line. The individual, Jivatma, minus life of desires, becomes soul and is always the unconscious Almighty. I agree with the second part, but I'm confused with this first part.
I will suggest that only follow Baba, what Baba has written. Not
Correct.
even people from the Mandali, not even them. I have seen them mixing their own ideas. I have read an excerpt from Meher something, which is a huge volume, page 3336 and 37. I was in fact, very upset about that page since the last 4 days. And it was really depressing. You can just go through, it's there online. And I don't want to name the person who has written, but it's not Baba who has written this. Please follow only Baba, no one else. They have all put their own minds.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Here by binding actions, he means karma. Okay.
Correct.
Wiping out desire is another desire. So don't think that you can wipe out desires easily.
Correct.
Not to there is. Now I'll talk. What is Vivek? I'll tell you what really Vivek is. I think Kama talked about Vivek. Only discriminating between real and unreal, not between unreal and unreal. Okay, so both Rag and Dvesh. Do you understand Rag and Dvesh? Everyone?
No.
Rag and Dvesh. What about Nomita, Sunil?
No, we don't understand.
Rag and Dvesh, you can just look up on Google. Roughly means roughly, although it is very broad, likes and dislikes. You have to both likes and dislikes. Okay. Otherwise, impressions will still be there. So the idea is, I spoke earlier also, is just witnessing. When Kama is doing Vipassana, is just witnessing his breath, his own mind in the breath. Okay. So that is Nirvikalp Sajakta or awareness. Baba has talked of that in the end of this. You'll find that in the last few pages.
Great.
Is the world choicelessness. So desire to wipe out desire is a desire itself. Go back.
Correct.
Yeah.
Sure. So continuing, last line of that page, the fifth and sixth planes of consciousness are fundamentally the planes of the mental sphere of the mind. In the mental world, mental conscious God in the man state is the master of his mind, whereas in the gross and the subtle worlds, when gross and subtle conscious, he was the slave of his mind. With the progress of the involution of consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state, the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world are realized by the mental sense, which is that of seeing. In the man state, when God is mental conscious, he is not conscious of the gross or subtle bodies, but he does work through the gross body and the subtle body, not directly, but on and from the mental plane. So, even if the mental conscious God in the man state is not conscious of the gross and subtle bodies, and therefore does not realize the experiences of the gross and subtle worlds, he still can unconsciously utilize the gross body through various aspects of the gross. He is thus observed eating, drinking, sleeping, seeing, hearing, and feeling as in an ordinary gross conscious human form, although he is all the while conscious only of the mental body with his mental sense of only seeing. Similarly, he can unconsciously utilize his subtle body through various aspects of infinite energy and is thus observed moving about actively and performing acts while all the time he is only conscious of the mental body, the mind, and only consciously experiences the mental world with his mental sense. Mental conscious God in the man state, in the mental sphere, has now only one sense, and that is of seeing. The mind persists through the fifth plane of consciousness. In the sixth plane of consciousness, the mind itself becomes the inner eye and sees God. In the seventh plane of consciousness, the mind is annihilated. Hence, it is that mental conscious God in the man state in the fifth plane experiences the impressions generated through his mental sense of seeing and consequently experiences the mental world with the mental body. He is now conscious only of mind. In this stage, God in the man state is capable of controlling the minds of gross conscious and subtle conscious states of God in subtle conscious and gross conscious human forms. But in the fifth plane, mental conscious God in the man state is totally incapable of performing any miracles because he is now in the mental sphere and no longer in the subtle sphere of the infinite energy when released resulted in miraculous powers. Yet, because he is mental conscious and is about to become mind personified, he controls the minds of the subtle conscious state of God and becomes the source which incites those in the state of subtle consciousness to perform miracles. He is the one who, in the mental conscious state, according to the desire and will of his mind, is capable of checking, controlling, or guiding the minds of those not in the subtle conscious planes, either to perform the miracles or not, though he himself, in his mental conscious state, cannot perform any miracle. God in the state, God in the man's state of mental consciousness is capable of creating and controlling the thoughts, desires, and emotions of all minds in gross and subtle conscious states. He is himself stable as soon as he experiences the state of the fifth plane, from which the state of consciousness involved thus far can never devolve or disintegrate. With this, I stop. We will, any discussions before we can wind up for the day?
I had a question in my mind.
Sure.
Tushar talked about rag and dvesh, like, dislike, vipassana, breath, and he mentioned that desire to eliminate desires is also a desire. Now, as human beings, maybe on the first plane or something, should we have a desire to eliminate desires, or we should not have and move straight to vipassana?
So is it a question to me?
Yeah, maybe
Yes,
Tushar,
yes.
you can explain. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. See, you should distinguish between the urge and urge comes from the will. Desire comes from sanskaras.
Mm-hmm.
Desire itself is a sanskara. Urge, which is inborn in us, as you see, the first urge, the first whim is nothing but an urge.
Right.
Am I clear about this?
No, I didn't understand. What do you mean by urge comes from will? Can you give me an example?
It's difficult. It's difficult to give an example because right now we are all talking a lot outside God speaks. This is outside God speaks. I don't know how to explain this. Distinct difference between desire and that part of will. Okay. First, whim itself is a part of a will and not a desire. There is a distinction between will and desire. So this is inherent in us. It's inborn, instinctive. Our process of going towards God is inborn in us. So what you do not desire is, in this instance, the example which was given there was a desire to kill desire. Okay. He didn't mention of urge to kill desire. Now, telling you briefly, I don't know when I'll be able to explain this. What you do right now is just watch your breath. I'm very sure, Kama, you've heard of Sakshi Bhav. Have you heard of
Yeah.
Sakshi? Yeah.
Yes.
Sakshi Bhav is nothing but witnessing. It's a part of Vipassana. Am I right?
Yes.
So, all you have to do is just with witnessing. Witnessing here means experiencing. Baba is using the word experiencing. Correct? Whatever you just experience them. Don't try to change them. Let it be the most horrible thought. If you feel like, let's say you have a thought of killing someone, let it come. Just let it come. Be a witness to that because it's a part of that. See, you can't change the mind. You can only be a friend with mind. And you'll only be chasing thoughts or creating. You can't annihilate them, thoughts. So the best process recommended by masters, by certain experiences, I will need an extensive to, convey to you all, including Kama's question. I will suggest you just
Hello?
experience your breath.
Yes.
I just want to add one more point. See, Tushar, I think when you talk about desire, I think it has to be based on context. Suppose I want to, for example, the desire for God realization is another form of desire. There is nothing like God realization.
Now we are
What
getting
we
into
are
cement.
no, once again, no. What we are dealing with is the only simplified thing I know is about the ego, and the ego is about sanskaras. And by using discrimination, we try to prevent ourselves from doing certain acts. The sanskaras try to drive you to doing certain acts, and you use your discrimination power, the vivek and vairagya, to not do that act. So that is what I think Baba says in terms of either you are spending sanskaras or unwinding sanskaras. So
I'll put it this way. What you want to do? Let's say you desire something. You desire to remove unreal, right? Let's put it this way. You desire to remove the unreal. By removing unreal, are you creating more unreal? Is there a discrimination between unreal and unreal? I'm asking this question. And then you can ask yourself this question, whether you're going towards real or you're going towards unreal. That is the only discrimination, only Vivek. There is no other Vivek. There is no Vivek within
I mean,
our
you're
thought.
talking real and unreal without examples. I mean, how can I say what is real and what is unreal?
The real is Paramatma, the Atma, that is real. The rest is all personality. Your personality, I had put this because I didn't want to confuse them. I deleted many of my comments in the chat. So I don't want to confuse people. I have explained already, Baba is explaining what is individuality. He has not mentioned personality. The rest is all personality. Sanskaras is a part of what personality. So sanskara is the unreality and your atma is the reality. So you just discriminate about a thing, whether it's going towards atma or is it going towards more sanskaras. That is real and unreal. Okay, this is the example I have given. This is a very broad example. I'm not giving specific examples. Am I clear, Kama? Otherwise, we'll have to sit someday.
On a lighter note, I'm reminded of class again. Like Nomita was the rank student that was reading up chapters before it's due. Now it's two rank students talking amongst themselves, and the others are just ignoring. Right? So
Not ignoring,
not
trying to.
ignoring. It's overhead transmission, right?
No, I think it's this medium, as I told you, it's becoming a hindrance for me. Because we have talked quite a bit in Calcutta, Kama, and I don't think we this gap at all when we were together.
No, there is no gap. It is just a process of uncovering. The challenges are the medium. The challenges are our personal impressions. The challenges are semantics, right? That there is a vocabulary that each of the masters use, right? There is a vocabulary, right? There's a construct that each one is comfortable with. So those are all the things that are coming in the way. All of us are, the intent is the same. The intent is not to point fingers or question, but it's a joint journey. But yes, there are some challenges in the process. Yes.
And with regards to your business, if you're using Teams, see, everyone's using the same semantics, right?
Correct. So that's very important, right? So the first thing,
it's very important.
For example, when we are building software, the first thing we do when we start with a product is write a product Bible, basically a glossary of terms, so that if there are 10 people from all over the world talking about the product and they use a particular word, they have to consciously use it in the context as defined. So it might mean something else to some other person in the normal context, but then it's very important to keep a common vocabulary. The context should be clear. Right?
Yeah,
So
I went through the glossary here. I think it is limited glossary here, which is mentioned. We are using at Theosophy. Now I'm coming here with Theosophy. A lot of people don't like Theosophy. I'm knowing this in the world, not here in the group. We have almost a 600-page glossary. Now it's online. And the I keep on reading just the glossary very often. Just as people read a book, I read the glossary. It's exhaustive and tremendous.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, it includes all the world religions, including not covered by Baba. All the ancient religions, Chaldean, which is extinct now, it's included.
Wow.
Heard of the Chaldean culture?
No, I have not.
It's pre-Egyptian culture. It is extinct now. So there's a whole lot of thing. But one thing I can tell you, what Baba is saying, what Theosophy is saying, what Buddhism is saying, what Mahavir is saying, they are all one and the same thing. So no one is saying anything new from the other. Okay.
Correct.
Whichever way you want to understand, we are all finally having the goal of getting into the Paramatma.
Correct.
And here we don't try to go into evolving in this life. You know, it's not within your hands because sanskara is not, you have to live. Baba is not going to extinguish your sanskaras. You have to live sanskaras. Baba will help you only in the involution. Understand very clearly. So it's to you. So don't say Baba is doing this, Baba is doing that. Don't. I am sick of this at the MPR. Every minute people talk of Baba has thought of this, Baba has desired this. No, you are there. You are also a God who is lagging behind. That's all. But we are all progressing towards that.
True. On that note, we'll pause this journey for today, and we will continue tomorrow.
Hi, I had something to say.
Sure.
Uh, Next week, are you able to prepone it by half an hour? Because it gets late for us, then it's
Okay.
like difficult to catch up with work.
I am totally okay. I'm an early bird, so 7:30 is no problem.
If it is okay with everybody, 10:30 gets a bit
Okay,
too late for us.
I
Because
wanted
your 8 is our 10:30, right?
Yes.
By then, staff is not motivated enough because I'm missing in action.
True.
we
So if
can
it is okay with everybody, I would like
Yeah, we can begin. I have one question regarding what I saw in a video. This off God speaks. It's interesting, actually. I am